more like the Force of Star Wars. My knowledge, I believe George Lucas is like a Zen Buddhist. That's what I've heard, at least. But when you look at the Force and you look at the nature of the Force with the light and the dark side, it's very much kind of that Western version. Like the Force has no personality, but yet even in Star Wars, they talk about the Force wills this. How do you will without personality? It's not really an issue for them. They don't deal with that. Not to mention, even if you really get into Star Wars, which my boys and I do, you'll see those almost Buddhist Hinduistic tendencies. The whole Jedi notion is to they don't want attachments. Like they have to reject attachments. That's why the Jedi, they don't marry. They're not supposed to. Like there's even whole episodes. Like I said, we've deep dived. Okay, we did the whole Clone Wars series, all that. But it's fascinating because you're seeing these pantheistic elements come out.
Socrates said an unexamined life is not worth living, which would imply an examined life is worth living. C.S. Lewis said good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. We live in a world full of bad ideas, and ideas have consequences. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you have not already, like, subscribe, and share this podcast with family and friends. A show where we examine life, contend with philosophies, ideas, and their consequences on today's culture. I am Rainer Thermal, and this is A Culture. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 10th episode of A Culture. Thomas McCuddy is back with us again for a milestone episode. First person to be on the show twice. First person to be on the show 3 times, and also now here for the 10th episode. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you, Rado. Looking forward to it.
Me too. I'm really excited about today's episode, as we're going to speak about Eastern Pantheistic Monism. And Thomas, you are at a unique advantage, seeing as you spent some time in Nepal.
So I did teach at a Bible college in Kathmandu. I was over there actually right when COVID was crisscrossing, got stranded in Nepal. That's a whole nother story. Caught the flu while I was over there. So, don't catch the flu in the middle of a pandemic because it'll go badly for you. But yes, having been over there and having worked with the Nepalese for quite a while and engaged in more so directly with Eastern philosophy, I bring a little bit of a different take. So,
yeah, looking forward to it. Before we dive in, Dr. Thomas McCuddy is president of Families of Virtue, a ministry designed for strengthening families and their churches through cultivating virtue and making disciple makers. He's also the director of professional studies and professor of apologetics at Carolina College of Biblical Studies in Fayetteville. He holds a BS in mathematics from Middle Tennessee State University, an MA in apologetics, and a doctor of ministry in apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Some of his interests are he's a fountain pen aficionado, love for languages, especially Latin and Greek, and his passion is reclaiming virtue in the Thomistic tradition. If you want to know a bit more about Dr. Thomas McCuddy, see the first episode we did together. I'll put a link in the show notes. So, Thomas, a fountain pen aficionado. That's an interesting one.
Hey, I've made several converts to that. I love the act of writing. It's therapeutic. It's joy. There's even a particular notebook, the Leustroms. They have this phrase in German, which means "think through the pen" or "think through the hand." And so yes, my pastor was just making fun of me the other day. Like I bought a pen that was on sale, and it was something like $20. And I was like, I know it's cheap. He's like, let's be clear. He's like, I think you have a skewed perspective on the cost of pens. I was like, okay, fair enough. But if you know anything about fountain pens, that's a relatively inexpensive fountain pen. But
I know nothing. I know nothing.
It's great experience. Like I said, several of my students are like, what? Okay, fine. And they try it. And it's one of those things. It's almost like, I know, going back to your episode on existentialism, once you have that existential experience, you'll never be the same. So
it's like people when they start using Mac or Apple products, they don't usually go back to Android or or Windows.
Indeed.
That's interesting. No, I haven't. But doesn't it smudge like when you're
Not too,
writing?
not it all depends on inks, depends on again the writing. I did calligraphy when I was in high school,
Okay.
so that's a little bit of my bias that I do like lettering and I do enjoy that. So my notebooks, when I take my notes, my pastor in particular, when he looks at them, he's like, these are almost like works of art. Like they're just so well organized and color coordinated. So again, it's the aesthetics, it's beauty. It's I can't draw, can't play a musical instrument, but I can write really well. That's my contribution of beauty into the world.
That is pretty cool. Beauty is important. So today's going to be a bit different, seeing as today's worldview that we're looking at is completely different to the Western ones that we've discussed. And before we get into the gears of it, how did you end up? You mentioned that you worked for Bible college there, but how did it build up and end up that you ended up in Nepal? That was a weird phrasing.
It was a really quick move. So I used to be a part of a ministry, and there were strong connections in India, which would include Nepal, and we had some people we were working with over there. And because of interconnections, they needed someone to teach apologetics at this college in Kathmandu. So, because when I remember it, I mean, it would have been like January of 2020. They said, "Hey, are you interested?" And I was on the plane in February, and of course, we all know March and began the lockdowns. So that's why, as we were planning this, like I was supposed to go with someone else, and he's like, "Yeah, I don't think I'm going." I'm like, "Oh, come on, it'll be fine." I did get home. I did get home okay, but I was stranded about 5 days. I got out 3 hours before the country closed down permanently. Like I just, by the Lord's providence, made it out. But I went over there to teach apologetics, to teach discipleship. It was a little Bible college, Ebenezer Bible College, there in Kathmandu, and so that allowed me to experience kind of firsthand Kathmandu being the most Hindu nation in the world per capita, percentage wise. India has, because of their Buddhist population, they're not as Hindu as Kathmandu is, or as Nepal is. But Nepal prides themselves in that Hindu tradition, which is why they were closed to the Western world for about 200 years, up until I think about the 1950s. And they opened back up. So really, the Church of Nepal is almost like a first generation. It felt very New Testament. Like everyone I met was a convert. I didn't meet anyone who was born into Christianity. And so the pantheistic Eastern mindset, Hinduism, Buddhism, those kinds of things proliferate, and including inside the churches. Like they were really struggling with how to sort this out, because when I teach pantheistic monism in the States, most of the students, because of our Western worldview, they're like, this is ridiculous. Like, why would anybody believe this? So over in the East, when you meet people who this is all they've ever known, they're like, Western ideas are stupid. Like, why does anybody believe this? You're all just selfish. Like, I mean, it's just it's fascinating to get in there and see the complete different modes of operation. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to go there. I wanted, never having been in Asia like that. I had been to the Philippines, but the Filipinos, I mean, everybody speaks English just about. So, I never had to have a translator. They're so impacted by Western society that, there's a little bit of cultural differences, but walking and being in Kathmandu, it's not only culturally a whole nother world, but even intellectually, the way they think about things, the whole mindset, even the way that the Eastern mind, for them, philosophy and religion are intertwined. For the Western, you read the Western philosophers, they're very like, no, we have to keep these things separate. There's religion and there's philosophy, and the two can talk to each other, but we got to keep them separate. For the Eastern writers, so when you're not reading about Eastern writers, when you read the Eastern the philosophers, they actually get really mad about that. They're like, why do Westerners have the corner on this? No, we unite religion and philosophy together. So that's why I think the monism, the pantheistic monism, and this is a worldview, creates a unique problem among the ideas, because we're like, well, go back to Buddhism. Is it a religion or is it a philosophy? Confucianism, is it a religion or is it a philosophy? And I know for a fact, when I was over there, there were several of them that Geisler would talk about these as philosophies, and people get mad. They're like, no, these are our religions. They are philosophical religions. And also just learning, there was another apologist who, learning the sensitivities. This doesn't have to do with pantheism, but even the Christians got mad when an apologist, a well-known Christian apologist, had said that the Buddha was from India. And what ended up happening, that even the Christians got mad. They're like, no, the Buddha was born in Nepal, what would become Nepal. He was enlightened in India, and they sort of blacklisted this guy because they got it wrong. So I mean, even the Christians, like they like, again, I'm sitting there in the Bible college, and I'm like, are you guys okay? Like, almost like the way maybe Americans get with sports teams and stuff. Like, they just got like, they were super prickly about this. So it was fascinating for me. It just shows the value. What I encourage people: why do international trips? Why go on missions overseas? Until you really land on the ground, you're not really going to gain that sense. You have no intuitive sense. You're always getting it in some sort of filter. So, as encouragement to anyone who's listening, who's ever thought about, like, well, is it really worth the expense? Yes, it really is, going in and seeing, because that's the way it was for me.
Wow, that's amazing. That sounds like there was multiple questions coming up as you were speaking, and then you would answer the question in the following sentence. Like, I was about to ask you, after saying that Nepal is the biggest Hindu population per capita, and I wanted to ask about India, but then you answered that one. So
Because those were my
pretty...
questions. Those are the things I asked, and they were very quick to explain. And the other thing, and it's worth noting, Nepal is so adamant about their Hinduism. That's why they have anti-conversion laws. So it's not illegal to be a Christian in Nepal. But my understanding is, if you if you share the gospel with someone, you can get 3 to 5 years prison. And if the person actually converts, you can do more like 8 to 10 in prison. So
Wow.
this becomes a particular issue when we're with the churches that are over there. It's like, what do we do? How do we do this? How do we evangelize in a way that isn't just going to, land everybody in prison? And that's a little bit of what we try to help with.
Okay, that's pretty cool. So we've used the word Eastern pantheism and the word monism a lot, but could you explain to the audience what those terms mean?
So, and this is, again, where it becomes fun, because we're so used to a theistic worldview where there is a God, or at least we have this distinction between God and us. So when you think about pantheism, and the idea of pan meaning all, so all is God, there's a wide range of understanding even among the pantheists. So I think this is also where Westerners, we like to keep categories very neat and clean. The Eastern mind does not, many times. So pantheism, the idea that all is God, it has various formulations, various manifestations. So we're going to paint very broad. The idea, we see it sometimes portrayed in movies, and it's a lot of analogies are used, because many times the Eastern philosophers, Eastern thinkers will tell you that you can't actually talk about it accurately. You find this in Taoism. My students often hate when I start going into Taoism, because to speak of the Tao is to not speak of the Tao, because the Tao is truly untouchable, unknowable. The moment you know the Tao, you don't know the Tao, and you just play this game of, like, what am I talking about? And the Taoist goes, exactly. So when we talk about pantheism, the idea of, if you imagine God more like the ocean, we are all drops. And that's why the concept of nirvana is more or less the drop returning to the ocean, because once you drop the water back in the ocean, how do you distinguish that drop from the ocean? You don't. It becomes part of the ocean. And again, that's an analogy, but that, if I can get a little nerdy, that was demonstrated somewhat in Star Trek Deep Space Nine with Odo and his race of shapeshifters. Like he sort of merged into the pool of shapeshifters there, and they would sometimes come out. So that's actually a pantheistic notion, that mindset of existence. So when we're thinking of this in terms of religion, like with the Hindus, the Buddhists, Taoism, Confucianism, and others, where everything is just kind of one or not, how does this all work? The doctrines are not clean. So getting just this notion that we're all, like some people would say, we're all like dreams in the mind of God. Are we really distinct? The primary basis is that there is no individuality. We're all, in that sense, made. If you want to say made from the same God stuff, some people say it that way, but it's really almost like a bad analogy, because there is no stuff. It's all illusion. There was actually a movie, if listeners want to check it out, Robin Williams movie, one of his less comedic roles, called What Dreams May Come. Cuba Gooding Jr., Robin Williams, and a couple others. The whole idea is he dies, and it's a very pantheistic notion. The idea that do you think that you're made of stuff? We're mind. The idea of mind, but again, it's a weird rendition. I actually showed it to my teenagers when I was a youth pastor, just trying to, and they hated it. They're just like, what was this? And I'm like, it's trying to portray this mindset that the reality you see is not really real. The only real reality is of the mind or the spirit. So that gets closer to pantheism. The Brahma is the main spirit. This is why when Eastern meditation, you empty your mind, because as you fill it with things, you've got all these distinctions, and you're missing the point that there are no distinctions. And this is why you empty your mind. You give the Om. That's the sound that's supposed to bring you like into union somehow with the ultimate. We don't want to call it divine, but it's to sort of disconnect you from this world, because in this world you see distinctions. There's me, and I would always say there's me, there's the table. The moment that, and this is not pejorative, the moment that you realize that you and the table are one, you're not actually different, because if everything is from God, then everything is God, in a sense. That's why it's pantheism. All of it is God, in a sense. So the Eastern pantheism is spiritual. Now, this is to be distinct. You might hear like even if you're familiar with the names of Spinoza, or even Einstein was a little this way. They were materialistic pantheists, that the ultimate is the material universe. So they kind of went the concrete. They're more like the concrete version. Definitely not spiritual. But the Eastern pantheistic mindset is much more spiritual, and that's why their sense of worship isn't really what we would think of as worship. It's more of directly connecting with the ultimate rather than honoring in that sense. But even then, it's very confusing, because you walk the streets of Kathmandu, as I did. I walked, and I rode a motorbike. I rode on the back of a motorbike. Most terrifying thing I think I've ever done on the streets of Kathmandu.
One of those scooters.
Yeah. I didn't get a choice. Like I was terrified. It just pull up a video of like Kathmandu in rush hour, and that's what I was in. But as you go down, it's when you read the Acts 17, and Paul talks about walking in Athens and seeing all the idols. That's what it was like. There's idols on every corner. There's these little, and there's all these colors and things where people have burned incense and thrown stuff in there. But the same way, almost like in America, you walk down the street like, oh, here's a fire hydrant, here's this, electrical box. No, it's like idols, different idols, little street idols. But even as you're walking along, there's even bigger ones, and these large, strange things. And it was a combination of Hindu and Buddhism. So the Hindus with their temples and the Buddhists with their monasteries are the distinction. But you would see that. You would see There was all like I thought when you look a picture of Kathmandu and you look at a picture of Nepal, you think of them, maybe this was what we did before I went. We looked and like, man, they're always partying, all these little triangular party flags. That's what it looked like to us. Well, no, those are prayer flags. Those have written prayers on them, and the idea is when they flap in the wind, it's like saying a prayer. I had no idea. I was like, that's the other thing. Like when you get there, you're like, this is not what I thought. Oh, okay. That's different. Was not expecting that. But that's kind of the mindset. There was such a they're much more spiritual in the sense they'll openly talk about things, they'll share. So they're not like Westerners who like to compartmentalize. It's kind of all encompassing. They do this. But again, trying to nail someone down, what do they believe? It's not like, again, over here, we want to know, what do Roman Catholics really believe? What is the Methodist doctrine? What do Jehovah's Witnesses believe? And, we want have all this laid out.
The usual response to Christians when they say God created the universe and all life is, but who made God? If you have questions like these, and whether if God exists, why do we suffer? Did He make grace? Is there a queer agenda? Book your ticket for the Apologetics SA Conference, Who Made God and Other Questions, 30 and 31st of August. Renowned speakers like Monique Toussaint, Nakasha Kotze, and friend of this podcast, Dr. Raymond Siava, will be tackling these important questions. Tickets are available at apologeticssa.co.za until 27th of August. Whether you want to attend live or virtually, book your ticket now.
Pantheism, you're not going to get that. It is much more in that sense, almost existential, if I can use that term. Like, it's much more about the experience of the divine. It's not about truth, because they tend to be pluralists. Like everybody kind of has their own way, and but there's still some of them will be that way. But again, the government of Kathmandu is very clear. We are Hindu, and if you're not, you better lack of a better term, you better watch out. Like, there's an element like don't go sharing. I mean, like this Bible college, it was a fairly nice big building. So the church is not underground in Nepal, but the country is very clear. We are Hindu.
So the church is allowed, they're just not allowed to grow.
Not allowed to evangelize. So
yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah,
I guess their idea is like, well, you have to reproduce your own, produce your own children, grow up that way. But there's no, to my knowledge, no law against if a person just freely converts. That's different from something like in an Islamic country. Like in an Islamic country, you can't leave Islam. But I don't believe that's the case like with Nepal. But again, it's interesting because on the one side, if everything is God and we're all moving toward Nirvana, why are we worried about these distinctions between Christian and Hindus? So these are some of the questions I have not entirely answered. But as an example of how things really get skewed, because over here in the States, when we teach Buddhism, we teach Buddhists don't worship Buddha. Well, in Kathmandu and Nepal, they do. And I got quickly corrected on that. And I'm like all my literature says that they don't worship Buddha. And they're like, we do. Like, that's what the Buddhists do. They worship Buddha as God. And I'm like, okay. So I think it really brings home the idea, going through a book like Sire's Universe Next Door or any of the worldview catalogs we have. I'm not saying those are bad. Okay. I'm always cautioning the strokes are very broad, and there's always an element when you engage someone, you have to be a little bit more like Socrates and figure out what you've got and what are we talking about, and don't come at it from a sense of, oh, I've read about Buddhism before. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. I read up on your country. I know exactly. I caution, like, have humility, that because even probably the person you're talking to, they could have also extremely skewed beliefs. It was in China. We met a Buddhist cab driver who also believed in evolution. And I'm like, Buddhism and evolution go together. In his mind, they did. So always ask questions.
Wow. Is there a difference between Chinese Buddhism and what you saw in Nepal?
There is, I mean, the Chinese Buddhism is also going to be a little bit more underground. It's not really as open. Like some of the figures and the symbols are there. They're not as against it as they are with like Christianity. But Chinese communistic, it's atheism. Like they don't like religion. But the Buddhism in China was much more. What's the word? It was just it was there, but not, like I said, you wouldn't know unless you were asking people. Versus when you're in a country like Nepal, like you can identify by style of dress, like you can see on people they're much more open. So, and again, I didn't get into the specifics when I was in China. That wasn't really our goal when we were there. But in Nepal, Buddhism would be the second largest religion, but it's relatively small percentage. I mean, it is vast majority Hindu, with Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity coming in as some of the lower, like maybe I don't remember what the numbers were, but we're talking like in some cases like single digit percentages of the population.
Sure. So they are pantheistic, and to achieve nirvana is to realize they are part of Brahman, to realize they're part of the ultimate reality. Yeah, like you said, the drop going back to the ocean type thing.
Yeah, so it's and again, we're dealing, whether you're dealing with Hinduism, Buddhism, or other forms, the very broad stroke is that whatever the ultimate is. So again, using Brahma, we'll just use that. We'll give it a name. It's not a person. Like we give it a name, Brahma, but we would picture a face. We almost picture a being. That's not what we have. It's more of the oneness of the universe. There's no personality that's there. Almost more like the Force of Star Wars. My knowledge, I believe George Lucas is like a Zen Buddhist. That's what I've heard, at least. But when you look at the Force and you look at the nature of the Force with the light and the dark side, it's very much kind of that Western version. Like the Force has no personality, but yet even in Star Wars they talk about the Force wills this. How do you will without personality? It's not really an issue for them. They don't deal with that. Not to mention, even if you really get into Star Wars, which my boys and I do, you'll see those almost Buddhist Hinduistic tendencies. The whole Jedi notion is to they don't want attachments. Like they have to reject attachments. That's why the Jedi, they don't marry. They're not supposed to. Like there's even whole episodes. Like I said, we've deep dived. Okay, we did the whole Clone Wars series, all that. But it's fascinating because you're seeing these pantheistic elements come out. They're like, don't you feel bad when somebody dies? It's like, well, I miss them, but we're not supposed to. Like if we start feeling bad, that's going to hurt us in the process. And they're one with the Force, and the Force is with us. So they've not really left per se. So you get this westernized version, particularly going through the Star Wars. That's pantheism. That's that idea. Like even when you're particularly listening to Yoda in the original movies, we're not material. We're luminous beings. The Force pervades everything. The rock, you, the ship. It's what binds all the universe together. And when you die, you merge back into the Force. You lose your personality. The whole Force ghost thing comes later. That's again not legit in that sense, pantheism, but it's giving you that mindset. You're starting to sort of understand what's going on and why the issue of why reincarnation becomes a big part of pantheism, because your goal is to merge back into the oneness, whether the oneness is the mind of God, if you want to say it that way, like with Hinduism, or the oneness is non-existence, which is the way Buddhism goes. So many times my students are shocked that Nirvana means two very different things to the Buddhist and the Hindu. But for the Hindu, you're more or less climbing up to merge back with Brahma. With the Buddhism, it's more of you're learning you don't actually exist. And when you finally truly understand that, you cease to exist. I have a great book. I should have brought it up here. called The Old Turtle. And it's about this old turtle that finally reached enlightenment and he ceased to exist. And the book ends. Okay. So never know what you'll find in the kids section. But that all of these notions, again, you want to the Western mind, okay, well, what are the doctrines? And I'm like, see, you're still operating like a Westerner. You're
Yeah,
still
like my first thought is like the polytheistic tendency. How is that mixing, even worshiping Buddha? How does that kind of fit into this?
well, and again, we call it polytheism, and I don't know if the term is right when it comes to things like Hinduism, because that's where I've read it and people say, well, they worship so many gods. And I'm like, sort of. Those are more like manifestations of God. And that's why there's so many, because it doesn't matter. It's not like
Okay,
in the case of the Roman and the Greek gods, where each god was very distinct. They had their own like area of expertise, for lack of a better term, and you couldn't blend them, and they were very particular. So the whole idea of everybody having their own household god, well, that's because we're all part of God anyway. So I'm just going to, where I am here, this is going to be what leads me back to the ultimate. Zeus was always distinct from all the other gods. That's why you had to have a temple for every single one. It was necessary. Like you couldn't leave them out. That's not the case with Hinduism. It's like, well, why aren't you worshiping this god? Like it doesn't matter, because they're all Brahma anyway. And that's why what's real interesting is again, when you get into the notions of reincarnation and how you're working your way up the chain, Nepal is very much still with the caste system. And again, we hear about that. We're like, okay, they have a caste system, like you're born into a certain level, and and the levels. And so we sort of think about it in the West, and I know because my students do this, they think of it sort of like, well, you got your people born uptown, and you got your people born downtown, you got your people born on the other side of the tracks. And I'm like, oh no. The stories I heard of people who just like one guy in a lower caste talking to, getting interested in a girl from a higher caste, and the village got together and killed the guy. Like, and everybody's like, that's cool. That's like, he crossed the
it
line. He
shouldn't
ought not.
have. Yeah,
Yeah. So for us over here, we're like, what in the world? But from the issue of you think of this as a, for lack of a better term, a salvation issue. That if you're going to do something that would condemn your soul. Now, as a Christian, I don't believe, like, again, like if I eat a particular thing or I marry a certain person, that's going to necessarily condemn my soul. I mean, it might hurt my walk with Christ, but the whole idea of marrying somebody in a different caste, like you're reaping bad karma upon yourself. Like this is, and it's also bad for the community. It's just, there's all kinds of bad that occurs through that. And so the lines are really strict, and I did not know this either. So I learned this when I went over there, because I want to know, how do you know who's in what who do you know who's at what level? And they said it goes by the last name, that when they ask your surname, they're sizing you up. And I was like, oh, at least where I was. Now, again, somebody listening, like, that's not how it works where I live. Directly, I was like, it deals with the surname, because that's what happens with some of the people who become Christian. They basically, like, their family tells them, you are not allowed in this house and you are not allowed to use our name. Like, you're cast out at that point. And so many Christians, many of their stories were like that upon receiving Christianity, even this one pastor who's working with discipleship across the entire country, he talks about how, like, when they have a family reunion, he is allowed to go, but he's not allowed to actually go inside. He can stand outside and, like, they'll keep the door open for him, or he can stand at a window. He's not actually allowed inside the house. And I'm like, wow. So there is a sense in which doctrines are fuzzy, but practices can be hardcore, which is almost kind of opposite with particularly evangelical Christians. We get
mm.
really particular about doctrines, but we just Sometimes we just do whatever. I'm like, so we have this disconnect as we have this very much other world, very much other mindset, and also even in their culture, they don't like. We are all products in the Western world of things like Aristotle's logic. They don't do that over there. How do you function without logic? And what I've seen inside the church is I've had to, that was one of the key classes we continued to teach when I got home. Like COVID allowed us to do Zoom. Like they opened up and we were able to still teach for a couple of years through Zoom. And that was the key thing. I'm like, you need basic logic. They didn't have that mindset of distinctions. They couldn't distinguish things because that's not how pantheism works. Pantheism, it's both and, it's whatever. We're all part of the mind of God. And so I found myself, I wasn't so much interested in engaging the doctrines of Hinduism. That's not how you deal with it. Not like when I'm dealing with a Jehovah's Witness or Mormon or some other defined religion. Like, let's talk the doctrines, let's talk these concepts. This was much more of learning how to think and going back, almost looking at Geisler's. This is why Geisler in his 12 points has points 1 and 2. The truth about reality is knowable, and the opposite of true is false. Like we have spent a lot of time there parsing those kinds of things out. And just for what it's worth, how well does Geisler's system stand up actually in Kathmandu? They hated the cosmological argument, bored them to death. But the teleological argument, they were on it. They loved it. And I was like,
wow.
Okay. Completely shocked. So it's in trying to nail down pantheism, the more you nail it down, the more you're breaking it, I think, in the process. It's not like that. And you have to, if you want to get into the Eastern religions, you have to learn how to think philosophically. This is why I also believe Christians are ill-equipped to handle the people in the East, because we don't think philosophically. We don't know how to incorporate that in our own worldview. We sort of stick philosophy over here on the shelf. We don't deal with it. And they were like, okay, we're going to evangelize anyone from the East. And you're just completely stuck. Like it's not working. Or you do things like I was so excited to use, and if you're in the apologetic world, you've seen that illustration. It's used in I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. The elephant and the blind men, and and so when I was there, I used this illustration there with 40 something people in my class in Kathmandu, and they're like, "Where'd you hear that? We've never heard that before." Like, what? Like over here in the West, like we're told like everybody shares this. He's like, we've never heard it. I was so disappointed. I was like, it was again one of those like massive slaps in the face between theory and practice. It's like, oh, okay. I'm gonna stop assuming. I'm gonna ask a lot more questions now because I don't know as much as I thought I did.
Wow, that shocked me as well. Because even I know Saya also uses the elephant, especially when he speaks about postmodernism. But he also has an illustration about the blind Hindus. Well, that was that was interesting.
I don't know. Maybe it was regional, but I can tell you in front of like these 40 students of mine, I was like, I'm learning lessons in humility, actually. So I'm growing in my own virtue as I'm just realizing that I think some of the things we get fed over here and some of the tools. I'm not saying that's a bad tool. I'm not saying that there aren't people who utilize that. Almost like when you go and there is an element, could be regional. You come down to the southern United States, there's going to be things we talk about and things that are just generally common knowledge that if you go up north, you go into the Northwest, nobody has any idea what you're talking about. So could be that, but it's again, pantheism is one of those that we have to approach as Christians with great humility. This is well outside of our experience. And even as we go through it, and again, it's like, well, I want to learn about Taoism. And let's say you take a course on Taoism, there's a good chance most Taoists would say you're actually, you know, less now than when you began. Like you actually, it's all bad information. And you're like, well, what's the good information? And they said exactly. And you're frustrated because you're like, well, wait a minute. Like, are you messing with me? That's why the value of learning philosophy as a Christian, if you're able to get into a different system that's starting with a different set of first principles or even a different concept of reality, and you're able to more or less move into that system and think through that system, even though we reject it, but be able to get in there and sort of at least understand it from that side, you're going to be much better equipped to handle the religious aspect of the East, and particularly pantheism. Looking at it from the outside, it's much harder. You almost have to kind of, in a sense, okay, I get in here, all right, I've got the sense of this, and now from my Christian side, I have an understanding of how to find the truth and build that bridge. But even the importance of listening to those who live in it, because I talked about that. I mentioned to my class, to their face, I said, in evangelism, we want to find the truth that they have, because every world religion, every group has some concept of the truth. Okay. They might, you know, it might be small, might be a little island, but no one's completely wrong. They told me that that's actually one of the reverse evangelism tactics of the Hindus, to say, look, your own book agrees with what we say, so come on back to Hinduism because we obviously have truth. And many Christians fall away because of that. And that, again, it gave me great pause. I was like, I hadn't thought of that from that kind of side or that kind of issue, but to that need to be clear with people that yes, there's difference between, there is truth in there. Just like if I've got, you know, a giant loaf of moldy bread, there might be good pieces of bread. Okay, that's what I want to look for. But don't eat the moldy loaf, which is quite different than maybe if you have a good loaf of bread and there's a couple pieces of mold on it. Well, that's like, in terms of, I would say with Christianity, some of the little bad doctrines. Okay, we need to fix this. We need to purge this a little bit, but we still have got a good loaf. We're still really good. And so trying to use those kinds of analogies, I think, help them. And it really kind of helped them understand, how do we engage the church that's in this pantheistic world? Because again, we think, oh, you've accepted Jesus, and we think they think just like us, but they still have this pantheistic mindset. They don't have the perspective, they don't have the background, they're not seeing it. And one of the things I think was interesting, we got into a hermeneutics book recently that I did not like. I didn't choose it, but the guy was talking about Asian versus the East versus Western thinking, Asian versus Western. And he kept talking about, you know, what can we learn? What can we learn? And sometimes we like to think, oh, the Asians, they got it all right. No, but they do have some things that are right. And it's not that we just want the Asian mindset to come right over here, because we as Westerners get things wrong. For example, in America particularly, everybody's a cowboy. We're so individualistic. In the language of virtue, we've taken a good thing, individuals, but we push too far. We've made it a vice. Okay. So the Asian that thinks in terms of culture and thinks in terms of family and group, that pulls us back. We're like, okay, this can bring us back to the center. So just in case anybody who's listening to me like, oh, he's just trying to make everybody Westerner, I'm trying to find what is true. And I would maintain that in the Western world, that particularly says that there is a really real reality, and that reality is unchangeable. I think that's a key portion. I don't think that is as much Western as it is the West readily accepts that. And it didn't come from the West. I think reality really is, and we have understood it. Kind of like if we think that, you know, well, who made the world round? No one made the world round. One culture may have recognized that. Yeah. But I think the West discovered that, but we discovered it. That's not a Western invention. We just happen to do that first, particularly because the Western mind says, from the theistic, there is a really real world and universe, and we want to find out everything we can. If you believe that the universe is not really real, you're not going to be as engaged. You're not going to worry about it as much. So now, in terms of community, we can learn some things from the East. I think we as the West, we've disconnected from that in a terrible way. But that doesn't mean I'm becoming Eastern when I do that. It's just let's get back to what is actually good and true. If that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
I don't want people to hear what I'm not saying.
That makes a lot of sense, and that kind of ties into you just spoke about you spoke about bring all the truths in the West and finding those truths and bringing them over, some type of thing. Like people asking, are there good things to find in the West, in the East? Sorry. So I was thinking of Saya kind of makes this argument where, as we've reached nihilism, there's been this attempt to find an answer to have meaning, and he illustrates existentialism as that attempt to find meaning. But then he kind of illustrates, but that fails. So the West then looks to the East to see if there are answers in the East. So I wanted, could you share a bit about what is there a different like code towards the Eastern pantheism coming into the West and the West adopting it? Because I'm guessing that it looks different than the true pantheistic monism that you encountered in Nepal.
There is very much if we should say it this way, a Western veneer on the Eastern ideas as we encounter them over here, which I think is what leads us to, well, I have all these friends and they're New Age, they're pantheists, they're this, and you go over into Asia, you're like, that's a little different. So I think that what Sire really brings out, which is helpful for us over here in the West, is that, like he said, when you fall into nihilism, you need something. So you're going to create an artificial meaning. You've extracted real truth, goodness, and beauty because of naturalism and the nihilism. Now you're going to try to inject that with existentialism. Well, because I think the Eastern religions, because they're less concerned with reality and more concerned about the experience with the ultimate, that's a great tool to get you what you want, because if you've disconnected from the creator God, now you have, like in the case of Buddhism that looks for, the proper means of extinction, you have a spiritual atheism, if we can call it that, because they're not, for the Buddhists that have no sense of God, they're just trying to get out of this cycle. It comes with no strings attached. It's all about you and your experience and overcoming that. So for the Western mind, who says, you know what, I really want something that brings me fulfillment, and it doesn't really matter anyway. So I really like the way Buddhists do this, and I really like this, and I like, and you just sort of like eclectically put this thing together, and then you have your happy Western version of what we think. It's the same kind of thing, and this might be a really bad analogy, but I grew up, my best friend growing up, his parents were from Hong Kong, so I got more traditional Chinese food than most people got, because I would always go over there and eat like every day, because I can't get squid soup anywhere else. So not the kind that like Miss Laura made. And so I would experience this. I was like, man, this is not what I'm getting at the Chinese buffet at all. We have Chinese buffets all over America. Okay, that's a huge thing. And I'm like, she would always kind of scoff at it. Well, when I went to China, I'm like, oh, that's why they scoff at it. Not the same at all. Like I don't even know. Like, they would even tell me, like, they would come in, they're like, some of these are just American inventions. We don't eat that stuff. Like, okay. But, as far as Americans, that's the only thing they know is Chinese. Most of the Americans, again, they love the fortune cookies. They want Chinese fortune cookies, but I think those were invented in like California. So they're not even Chinese.
Wow.
Like, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure those are like an American invention. So when we have this Americanized, existential, spiritual system that, again, just pulling pieces from the East. That's what I kind of caution people is it might have a form, it might be loosely based on, but don't be confused. Almost like with that, again, talking movies, Noah's Ark with Russell Crowe. That is a movie that is loosely based on the concepts that are sort of connected with the Bible. It's one of the, like, there's a boat and there's, I don't know. No, it wasn't Russell Crowe. I think his was a little bit better. There was a major, I don't remember who was in it, but there was one. I mean, Lot was there on a raft. There was a tornado. I mean, it was awful. Like, you're like, they
Wow.
didn't even live together. It was so bad. So I think no, I haven't seen the Russell Crowe one. I can't speak to that one.
The Russell Crowe one is based, but there are some weird things in it. Like, yeah, it's evolution. So they show the theistic evolution essentially, and then at the end, I think I can't remember exactly, but I think at the end, God asks Noah to kill his children or something like that.
Okay, so if you've never read the scriptures and you watch Noah's Ark or you watch some of these movies, that's going to form your concept. And then when you get into it, this happens with almost all the movies that people watch first and then read the book. They're like, they almost make the claim the book changed. No, literally, the book was original. The movie changed it. Okay. Movies like Blade Runner, which was really popular, the Harrison Ford one, the original. So I read Do Robots Dream of Electric Sheep, I think is the actual name of the book that Blade Runner is based on. Blade Runner is way cooler name, by the way. But I read the book. I mean, like, very different. Like, everything was just radically different. And I was like, wow. But my whole concept of Blade Runner and like just like, and I like those old 80s sci-fi movies, you know. So I go in and I read this book and I'm like, what did I just get a hold of? This is so different. But that's the original. That is the orthodox, if we can call it that. So for us over here in the West, we're getting a very unorthodox version many times. That's the caution. That's why if we're kind of learning about pantheism, you'll get a sense if you go down to, like, we have actually a Hindu cultural center here. They can be really particular, but you're going to get a sense if you find some people who are into Eastern meditative practices. Just yesterday, we were library hopping. We're having it was the last day of summer reading, and we had to go to the different libraries and get our stamps for going to the reading. Okay, so this wasn't when you homeschool, you do crazy things, but we go and we do this, and one of the libraries, never been there, and they had all these packets, and one of them was like their summer activities. One was learn how to code. Oh, this is, stuff in August. I'm like, this is good. One was I forget, it was maybe like cooking or something, and then one was on mindfulness and meditation, and it had all these little kids in the lotus position, and I was like, I pulled one, and even my oldest, who's now 14, he's like, what are you doing? I was like, I want to see what this is. Like, you're not going to it, but like, I'm like, what are we promoting here? But it's those ideas come east, and it's the whole mindfulness is huge in the American business world. It's a sprinkling of these Eastern meditative practices, which are much more existential. How does it help you get along in the world? Not at all entirely like religious or philosophical. Very pragmatic, which is, I think, the Western corruption, where we will do anything if we think it will help our bottom line. And that's what you find with the East moved West. That's what I think, in a big way, you're seeing. So that's the caution I give is, as I found, as much as I had been exposed to it, how radically different things were amongst the majority. The other thing I tell my students, I say, keep in mind, per capita, pantheism wins the day in worldviews. In sheer number of people, like, you just do head count, pantheism's going to win. So that's when they're like, many times they think, well, this is weird. Who really believes this? I can say the majority of the world believes that, or some form of it.
Wow, that is interesting. That is, but And I remember speaking to you personally about, in terms of like the laws of logic, which and not the law of non-contradiction comes to mind, and you spoke about the way they live. How do they conduct business then on a daily basis?
But see, in our mindset, we would say, well, if you disregard logic, but you act logically, you're being inconsistent. But because they disregard logic and they're being inconsistent, that's not an issue because the logic doesn't apply. You do what you need to do, but that doesn't mean that you're adhering to it. You just do what you need to do.
Okay.
And again, the problem is in this life, if you start thinking about we're dreams in the mind of God, we have to play by the rules of the dream, which again, some of the terminology, the Maya, the illusion, that's the larger concept. What they're trying to do in their lives is break free of the illusion. We're stuck in it. So sometimes to get along, you got to play the game. But eventually your goal is to increase in that enlightenment and break free from it, which is why, again, the meditative practices. I saw an interview with the Dalai Lama who was talking about the idea that, the amount of meditating he does, which is to literally empty his mind, and how he spends the vast majority of the day with his mind empty in meditation for that purpose. But he's also the Dalai Lama. He can do that. And, you can't do that if you're like running a business. You can't just sit there with, and blankly meditate. You got to run your business. Well, again, if you're in the lower caste and you find yourself, having to scrape along, do the best you can, go through the reincarnation, keep going up the cycle, and eventually you can reach that. So you go in, you play the game of logic. There's some element where as you're engaging people, I think, and I hesitate to say this, but here's what I found to be, at least from the whole everyone I talked to, this is what I found. The vast majority of Christians that converted to Christianity in the country of Nepal, according to the Nepalese, according to different churches, different pastors, and these are guys pretty widespread. So I'm not saying I surveyed the entire nation, but I'm saying the report I get from several corners, majority of Christians come to faith through miracles. Something miraculous happened to them. In the case of one of the guys that we were working with in our ministry, so I knew this guy. Actually, when I went to Nepal on one of my weekends, I actually got to go to his village, got to go to his house, got to meet his Hindu parents, got to meet his Hindu sister. He came out of Hinduism. Well, the way he came out, and again, so this is not hearsay, like from third, fourth, fifth. Like we're sitting together. Here's a man in the ministry, working the ministry, completely humble man. He says when he was born, he grew up with these debilitating headaches, and so I guess the equivalent of like a migraine. So here he is in his late teens, early 20s, and he would just get, just be crippled by these headaches. Nothing the doctors could do, no solutions, no medicines. So he's walking one day and he ends up getting hit with this headache, just again crippling him, and he's right outside of church. So he's like, I've tried everything. So he goes into the church, the Christian church. He lets them know, hey, I'm a Hindu, but will you pray for me? He's like, I don't know what else to do. They prayed for him. He said immediately his headache left and has never come back. And at the time I knew him, he was in his late 20s. So, you hear many of these stories. One of the problems that the church is facing in Nepal is because they've come to Christ through a miracle, they want to see more, but they don't always follow. It's kind of like, those who got the manna, and then there was a day the manna stopped because now you're on your own. I mean, there's still things that are happening that I think just far outweigh anything happening in the United States. But I think there's an element where for the Eastern mindset, you almost need, like, that's what needs to break through. When you're disconnected from reality, which is what can happen in pantheism, you don't believe reality is really real. You don't believe, if you don't believe that you are really real, that there's no real you, and that to talk about you is to actually not talk about you because there is no you to talk about. You start playing these games and your brain hurts. Well, if that if that is what you're saturated in and you've grown up with, there is, I would maintain, such a darkness there, because if reality is really real, what other tool do you have to connect with? What can you use? So it's different when I'm dealing with somebody who if I'm talking to a Muslim, we've got a creation, we've got theistic gods, we've got miracles, we've got all these shared components. Now we need to talk about it. Usually it boils down to, is the New Testament reliable? That's the linchpin, but it still is all in the same backdrop of the same reality. And we can engage with great precision. What do you do when somebody's rejected reality? They believe everything is God, nothing's really real, we're all mind. What evidence do you use at that point? Because any evidence is in the world that they don't believe that exists. Like, if you're that hardcore in pantheism, what is it that's going to break you free? And so in the country of Nepal, that's the majority. I mean, it's not everybody. There are those who hear the gospel and receive it with joy, that their mind is enlightened. But for many, it's almost like with Israel, they had to see the power of God to really know he was there, that, oh, I've been chasing the wrong thing all this time. So again, that's not our experience here in the West. That's not our experience in America. So all of this is that encouragement. We need to learn what we can. But while I was over there, and we were in a bookstore with my friend who had come out of Hinduism, I said, give me 2 books in this whole bookstore. You point them out, I will buy them. Give me 2 books that will help me. And he chose Intros into Asian Philosophy. He's like, you want to do ministry here? You're going to need to read these. Okay. They are not easy. And one of them particularly just begins, like, his whole first chapter is, let's be clear, Greeks were throwing that out. Kant, leave it alone. Like, he just all the things that have moved and molded our Western mind, he immediately attacks. He's like, get rid of it. That's not where we are. Purge it. Now we can start talking. And I'm like, this is not easy. This was, because again, this is what we've always known. This is how we always think. I think that's the challenge. I think this is why, particularly in our ministry, like, we still help out with Nepal, but there's an element to me. There's almost like, this month I celebrate my 44th birthday. This is almost for younger men. These are for younger missionaries who can engage and dive into this, saturate themselves to be the experts to make those connections. I can still dabble, but this almost requires, it requires much more than what I've got to give to really be that impact. Like, if we were going to be boots on the ground in Nepal, or again, I would say that's the same thing for India. That's the same thing, even in some ways, for China. You've got to really bridge a gap. Like, as you go through your worldviews, atheism, deism, theism, cults over here, even naturalism, nihilism, all of these are in our territory, so to speak. We understand these. Even existentialism, got it. When you move to pantheism, you've crossed the pond, literally. There is a wide gap. Almost as you're stepping from worldview to worldview, I would maintain there is a gigantic leap to the Eastern Pantheistic Monistic mindset that requires so much more than what we're accustomed to here. Whole different way of thinking. Even the languages, the way that the languages are constructed, they communicate differently, and so there's almost an element. I learned this when I learned Hebrew, that Semitic languages, they don't operate like Latin and Greek, like those Indo-European languages. I was fine. I got into the Hebrew, and I'm like, their whole way of constructing concepts is a little different, and I found it unpleasant. And the whole reason is like, this is a lot more work, and that's what I think is required to really get into that pantheism. So That's my encouragement to those, particularly this is the struggle I face with some people who I actually know some American missionaries who are in Nepal. They don't have a fat clue about the worldviews, any of that. And they're like, we're just going to share the love of Jesus. And I'm like, if you knew a little bit more, you could be so much more effective. Like, I'm glad they're going to share the love of Jesus. I get it. But you can do that well, or you can do that poorly.
Yeah.
And I think we're more guilty of doing it poorly than we are doing it well.
So if I can sum you up, so there's a marathon lying ahead in terms of the work to be done from a Christian perspective, but you also need that training before you can actually go in and dive in and attempt to go the long distance.
I think that's key, particularly with the Asian mindset. As one example, because again, we want to go share the love of Jesus. And when I was in the Philippines, they told me how there was an American missionary who came and he went to the mall and he would just go up to people and be like, hey, to you, who is Jesus? Now, in America, in evangelism training, we're taught these kinds of things, like ask people 4 spiritual laws, ask them, to you, who is Jesus? Sire even taught several of these things in several of his books. So he was doing this at the mall, and man, everybody he's talking to is accepting Jesus. Like he gets to them and he's just amazed. He's like, I'm bringing in a bountiful harvest of souls, if you want to give the good evangelical lingo. Well, while he was at the mall, there was a gentleman who he had talked to came back up to him and he said, hey, can I take that back? Like, I was just being nice. Like when you came up and, accepted Jesus, he's like, but I really didn't mean it. And I kind of feel bad. So, I'm just letting you know, I'm taking that back. And the Filipino there that were with me, they basically were saying, you Americans just don't get it. Like, we're Filipino. We're because they're Asian, they're not going to be rude. They're like, and I've always joked, that's like, I'm a rude American because I'm so direct. They're not. It's a whole different way, even just culturally. Like when I was in China, I asked my students, do you understand? And they would say, yes, teacher. And I would ask them to give me some information, ask a follow-up question. They had zero clue. Well, I learned they will not make the teacher look bad. They will bold-faced lie to you, say they understand when they do not have a fat clue. That's cultural. These are things in the West we don't understand. Americans in particular. Americans, like, we say what we think. That's why we have the reputation we do with the rest of the world. So I can't emphasize enough for those who want to share Jesus to learn about the kind of people that you're going to talk to, whether it's Asia, whether it's Africa, or whether it's your neighbor. That is critical to understand, not just about them and their basic ideas, but that worldview. Where do they stand? What do they believe about these things? Because you might use the same words, but it could be a completely different dictionary. And all the way to the level of what is truth, reality, and God. Jesus is the Son of God means so many different things to so many people. And to go up and to ask somebody, do you believe Jesus is the Son of God? Yes. Do you want to put your faith in him? Sure. Because if he's one more deity on the shelf, what does it matter? We're really bad in the Western church of thinking everybody in the world thinks just like us, for right or for wrong. Okay. Whether or not they should or they should not, we think they think all like us. And I think pantheism, particularly monism, is one of those places that I think jars us awake, that the rest of the world might be coming from an entirely different place and we don't get it.
Well, thank you for that. I think that is a beautiful note to end off on. Thank you. So there's definitely some work to be done, and we can't have an armchair lazy approach if we want to make a difference in this. Thank you. All right, everyone. As usual, I will put the links in the description where you can find more out about Dr. Thomas McCuddy, as well as Families of Virtue. And Thomas, thank you very much for this episode.
Thank you, Reno. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Okay, guys, until next time, be blessed. Goodbye. Thank you for watching and or listening to Hey Culture, a podcast that wants to shine a light in the darkness. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, share, and ring that notification bell. On Apple and Spotify, please review and rate this podcast. I'm René Fermor, and this is High Culture.